Hello, everyone. We're going to be presenting on our project for this class, which is tracks classification. Below, you can see the members of our lovely team, and we are excited to introduce this project to you guys. So, over the next 10 to 15 minutes, we're just going to have an introduction, talk about the problem, then we'll go into the data that we use to train our models, and then, of course, walk through the models, which will be the meat of this presentation. We'll talk about what we concluded or kind of our accuracy and some of the outcomes and some interesting things that we did with the data and the models that we were able to collect, and finally wrap up with future scope. If we had another month or two, what types of things could we have done to make this even more interesting? But to get out started, all projects definitely need some reasoning behind it, and animal tracks is a big thing around the globe. We have so many scientists that are going around through forests and deserts and looking at footprints, trying to identify which animals were there, which animals have been there recently. This is useful for extinction tracking and different other methods like that. So this could be used for wildlife conservation, different monitoring strategies, as well as outdoor education and stuff. But this is really useful. Right now, a lot of times scientists have to look at tracks on the ground and manually try to identify using their books, figure out what species could it be. If we're able to create some sort of automatic way to do this, we could really scale things up and help the whole world of footprint tracking. So with that said, I do want to hand it over to Sam, and he'll walk you through the data that we've used.
All right, thanks, Aryan. So the data set we're using is Open Animal Tracks data set. All the images were collected manually by researchers in the field. On our right-hand side, you can see that these are just some sample images from various critters that were collected by researchers. In total, we have around 2,500 training data samples, so just individual images. And that splits into 18 different species that our models will be classifying towards. So in terms of processing, we took all of the images and we resized them to around like 224 by 224, just to make sure that everything's really consistent when we're taking it into our models. The second thing we did was that we applied some image jitter to the images themselves. And what that means is basically adding essentially like random color saturations to the images. So although the images were taken in variable weather conditions, such as like snow, dirt, and mud, it also just adds an extra layer of randomness so that the models are really capturing the contours instead of just like the colors of the images themselves. And lastly, we also introduced some random orientation into the images. So, for example, not all the animal footprints are upright. Some of them are sideways, some of them go diagonal.
Perfect. So the first model we're going to talk about is just a CNN. For this, we used ResNet and took advantage of all the pre-training that has gone into that because these footprints really, at the end of the day, only rely on, kind of like Sam said, the contours. We don't need to know much about the shape, the orientation. So by using ResNet, we could get a lot of that pre-trained ability for what those shapes and dynamics look like. I won't go too much into detail with the logistics of what we did for the setting up of the CNN, but we did get pretty good results of 65%, which is impressive given that there's about 18 different classes. We had really good output with the model itself. And so if you go to the next slide, you can see what is kind of the matrix of the accuracy based on different kind of species. And one thing to note is that the model did a really good job of separating the animals into those that have appendages or like fingers and those that are more like hoofed, and then also those that are more like webbed or like clawed feet. And so an example of that, you can look at, for example, the gray fox. The gray fox is an animal that has appendages. And if you look at the values that pop up of where it made mistakes, those are also animals that have appendages. So the biggest mistake for a gray fox was a coyote, which is to be expected. The model was able to highlight a gray fox and a coyote's feet look similar. And with more data, we can more likely get a closer result to what the true value of the gray fox is. And that's the same thing for things like horses and elephants with a similar shaped feet. The model made errors logically. You weren't seeing it mix up things like an elephant with a goose, which would have very different feet shapes. So that's all I have for that point. And the last thing I want to touch on is just on the next slide, you'll see we also attempted doing some dynamic freezing, ended up getting roughly the same results. And so we chose the model that was quicker to train, simpler to train, just from a business standpoint that made the most sense. So I'll pass it off now to Brenda.
Cool. Thanks, Hayden. So we also wanted to see if we can capture any long-range dependencies through a vision transformer. We pre-trained this model on what I had in the slide here. Basically, it's pre-trained on ImageNet, just to see if we can capture already pre-trained robust feature representations. Similar to our CNN, we implemented cross-entropy loss, use Atom Optimizer, as well as a learning rate scheduler where it was reducing the learning rate by a factor of 0.1 every 5 epochs. And in doing this model, we didn't get the greatest accuracy. It was overfitting quite a bit. And this is mainly just because, animal tracks have very subtle differences. So the data set is kind of limited in size, and also the model was struggling a bit to generalize perfectly. So we wanted to tweak that a little bit. And on the next slide, you can see we tried freezing, where we did the same thing, used the same parameters, but at the start, we froze all layers of a vision transformer to prevent any updates, and then we used selective freezing. So we unfroze the classification head and then the last 2 transformer blocks. So that meant that the model can start learning high-level features relevant to our data set without disrupting well-established lower-level representations. And then after epoch 5, we would unfreeze 1 more block, and we would do that every 5 epochs. So once the model has a chance to adapt, then we unfreeze any additional transformer blocks and then also reinitialize the optimizer. So it now includes the newly unfrozen parameters. And the goal here was to stabilize any learning and account for any of the mistakes it was making in the previous model. However, again, it was overfitting quite a bit, and our final accuracy turned it out to be about 58%. And so, again, that might be just because of the subtle differences between animal tracks and our small data set size. So in the future, maybe we'd implement more hyperparameter tuning and increase our data set. But all in all, on the next slide, we can go into our outcomes, and we can see that our CNN had the highest accuracy, not the greatest results, but given what we had to work with our data set, it's the best that we could do. Perhaps in the future, we could implement, more transfer models, as well as retrain the last layer for our CNN freezing, or just experiment with more hyperparameters in general. And with that, I'll pass it off to Sarah.
Okay, thank you, Brenda. So let's go ahead and look at our actual user interface. So in order to create this, we had to download the model itself and then pipe it into a Streamlit package in Python in order to create the user interface. Now, this is very important for us to create. That way we could actually visualize what this project could be used for in a business sense or an educational sense. So the idea would be that ideally a user would find an animal track. They wouldn't exactly know what kind of animal it is, and they would be able to upload a photo of that specific track into this user interface, and then the model itself will be able to classify and determine what the actual animal is, and it will also output a couple of facts and additional information about the animal itself. Okay, so let's go ahead and actually test out the user interface now. So here we can see I have 4 different images that I would like to classify. And we can see here that the 2 most right photos, we can probably by the human eye be able to determine that this definitely is a horseshoe print, as well as this being a turkey print. But we want to make sure that our model was actually able to capture very obvious photos as well as more distinct photos. So let's go ahead and give this horseshoe a try. So we can see here that the user interface was able to upload the photo itself and enlarge it. And it was also able to classify that the animal was in fact a horse. And we gave some additional information about the animal itself as well, such as their habitat and climate that they live in, where exactly they're located, and 2 different fun facts about the animal as well, such as how horses can sleep both standing up and laying down. So as we know, this is a very obvious photo, and from the human eye, you can definitely tell what kind of animal this would be. But what if we didn't exactly know what animal a print was linked to? So the goal for this would be that the model would be able to pick up on key features and determine that this photo specifically right here would be a beaver print. So from my eye, I couldn't even tell you that there's an animal print there, but I received this photo from a very reputable source online, and they were able to classify it as a beaver print. So we wanted to make sure that our model could classify it as a beaver print as well, given that that was one of our animals. And it was in fact able to classify it as a beaver print. So we definitely took that as a win. And then for animals that have very similar tracks, such as foxes, coyotes, bobcats, and possibly even a black bear. We wanted to make sure that the model was picking up on very distinct features of a photo as well. So let's say for coyotes, for instance, they are known to have very tall and long claws, as well as having a specific paw shape. So we wanted to make sure that this model would be able to pick up on a lot of those key features as well. And thankfully, it was able to determine that it was a coyote. So that is the end of our user interface. And now I would like to pass it off to Arian to talk a little bit more about our future scope of things.
All right, thanks, Sarah. And last but not least, we're going to go into the future scope. What could we do with some more resources, or if we had another month or two? Obviously, there's always ways to make any sort of model better. The first thing is always get more data to train. Obviously, we did have a pretty robust data set that we got online, but collecting more images, from these different species and their footprints would obviously be able to make our accuracy a lot better, and especially with identifying the subtle differences that might exist between two similar footprints. And we had 18 species here, but obviously there are a lot more species that are being identified and looked at in the world, and maybe adding a couple more variety species into the data set would be helpful. Another thing we thought about was just increasing the variety of images. So we did a little bit of tuning when it comes to like color and stuff, but also looking at different angles, taking it from a 40-degree angle, a 15-degree angle, instead of just the bird's eye view. That could definitely help make the process easier if we were able to scale this so that, people that are taking this picture don't have to take the perfect image, but can quickly snap a picture and move on to the next one. And finally, creating a platform. Sarah just demonstrated what we could potentially do by building a platform and creating an interface where this could actually be used in a business setting. But with that said, this is the other ways to enhance our project, but we are pretty satisfied with where we got, and we hope you are too. Thank you so much.